Guys, do you remember the anxiety, like the tension that you felt when you had your last product interview? Yes, so that's exactly how I'm going to make you feel during this presentation. But relief is going to follow at the end, nevertheless. So it's going to be about mastering PM interviews. Well, that's a bold name. But before we dive into the content, just a few brief words about myself. So currently, I'm a group product manager for Bolt at Rentals. Rentals encompasses two verticals. One is micromobility, scooters, e-bikes. You're probably familiar with our e-scooters. And car sharing, our drive business. I've been at Bolt for over 2.5 years. It's been quite a ride so far. Prior to Bolt, I've been a leading product at such companies as OLX and Yandex for a variety of years, plus I had experience of funding, like starting my own startup. And besides, coincidentally, I also have a PhD. And I'm constantly battling this internal academic in me. But on that note, I'm writing a weekly Substack where I'm sharing practical advice on how you can advance in your product management career. So I highly advise you to subscribe. Before we start the presentation, who am I even to tell you all of this, right? First of all, well, I'm an active product interviewer. So up to date, I've done more than 400 product interviews. And I've been exposed to a variety of seniority levels, from early stage associate product managers to director level product managers. I've interviewed functions that are adjacent to product management, like data analytics and product design. And moreover, I was lucky to be exposed to a variety of cultures from across the globe. So I do have a few humble tidbits to share with you that might be helpful in improving your chances of scoring that offer. So a map, like what I'm going to tell you about and how it's going to flow. First of all, we'll start with the context and the interview funnel. That's where the tension should get at its highest. And then I'm going to give you a relief. So we're going to talk a little bit about on what pitfalls you should avoid based on my practical experience. And I'm going to share a practical framework on how to crack any product management interviews. And at the end, we're going to flip the narrative and look at it from a totally different lens. How product managers are actually assessed by the interviewers. Of course, this is going to be very bold flavored, but I think it will benefit you anyways. So let's kick it off. At the current moment, there are 850K product managers globally. Out of this big data set, 221K, or roughly one-fourth, are actively looking for a job in this field. If we look on the supply side of this marketplace, there are only 5K jobs actually available. And if we zoom in to a specific subsegment of this, which is like big tech, like Meta, Alphabet, Amazon, Netflix, then we have like roughly 100 of jobs that are available at the current moment. So when we look at the ratio, the competition is quite intense. For an average tech company, it's like 25 candidates per single job listing. And the competition is actually quite fierce when it comes to big tech. It's like 4,400 candidates per a single job listing. Just think about that number. So that's how I feel when I look at that number. Let's try and unwrap this mystery, like what the hell even is like a product management interview. So it all starts with a funnel. So that's how a typical funnel looks like. And there are two important variables here. Like one is it's the seniority of the candidate, and another one is the duration of this whole process. And depending on the seniority level of the candidate, there might be different amount of steps in the process. So if we're talking about IC level roles, like up to senior product manager, most likely you're going to be faced with 4, roughly maximum 5 product interviews. Of course, this varies from company to company, but on average, this is going to be around it. If we're talking about managerial roles like GPM+, then you're going to be grilled maybe on 6 interview stages plus. But if we're talking about more senior positions like director, VP roles or whatnot, then you will have at least 7 interviews. And The second variable is the time frame, and time frame is dependent on the seniority. So if we're talking about early stage product management roles, then most likely it's going to be around 2-3 months. That's the whole time frame. If we're talking about more senior leadership position, that it can easily be 6 months plus and even more. But there is one commonality between all of those stages and between all of the seniority levels. There are 3 product interviews which are key, and no matter how senior you are, you're going to face them. And these are product design, product execution, and product strategy. Yes. Now let's unpack them. First of all, those types of interviews, they define the type of questions you're going to be asked. And the first bucket is the strategy. It's the most ambiguous one. Typically, like what I see on the interviews is that product managers, they go with the mantra, that's the user, that's the problem, that's the solution. Well, you're going to fail a strategy interview if you come up with that answer, because it requires you to think outside of the box. There is much more complexity to a specific feature. You have to figure out what is the actual business behind it, and how can that business succeed. Like one typical example that I like to ask, hey, we want to start, I don't know, a tea selling business. How do we do that? Or like, what's the next big business opportunity for Bolt? That's a pretty ambiguous question, right? The second type of product case questions are the product design. Those ones are geared at testing your customer empathy, and they're pretty straightforward. Like, how do you design, I don't know, a taxi experience for animal carriage? Or like the classic one, what's your favorite product? And the third bucket is the execution. Execution is about testing the depth of your thought and how well you are with logic. So ideally, the goal here is to figure out the specific root cause that created a certain problem. So you have to kind of think inductively there. Typical question that most candidates face on this stage is, well, our user acquisition, or like put whatever metric there is, has dropped by 15%. What the hell should we do? And it's your goal to figure that out. So, now that you're familiar with the competition, now that you're familiar with the funnel and the types of questions there are, let's proceed to the practicalities. How do you crack that freaking interview? But before we dive into the actual framework, I want to give you a few principles, right? A few things that you can avoid that would immediately increase your chances of winning, of scoring the tender. Because I've kind of abstracted those from hundreds of interviews, and the beauty is you don't even have to be super senior. You just have to change your thinking. You just have to be a little bit more aware, internalize those before you go into the interview. First of all, you would be surprised, but 95% of the candidates never clarify the goal. And every single case question that is asked is shaped in such a way that the goal is concealed from you. For example, like design a jobs product for Facebook. Sounds straightforward, right? Well, it is not. The thing is, there could be a variety of goals underneath it. It could be, I don't know, we might need some cash, generate some revenue, or we might want to build a profitable business opportunity. Or it might be on the user acquisition side, which means that we might want to cross-pollinate users from this vertical to the other one at a lower acquisition cost, right? It can be anything. And 95% of candidates, literally that's the exact number, never clarify the goal. If you don't do that, you immediately lose scoring points during the interview. Another side effect to this is losing focus on the goal itself. Sometimes just for the pro forma, candidates ask like, what's the goal? Okay, it's profit, and then they end up with the revenues. But profit is more than just revenues. You have to look at the cost side of the equation as well. Or they end up with user metrics, I don't know, activation, retention, engagement, whatnot. But it was not the initial goal that was set up by the interviewer. So be very diligent about figuring what the goal is and keep that in mind during the whole interview process. The second one, it is actually a sin. Always have a structure. Because if you don't, you are increasing the risks. And there are two risks here. One, you will lose the bigger picture, and you will over-focus on minor details that have less leverage. 2, you will just crumble, because there are new inputs coming during the interview, and you might just lose track of your thought and end up with a fuzzy thinking. Like from my experience, literally maybe like 3, 4 candidates were able to pass the interview on the go without preparing the structure beforehand. And this is very correlated to their seniority level. Usually those are director type of candidates. So please take your time, think through the structure, write it down, and only start answering the case with the structure in mind. Another pitfall is being too theoretical. What I mean by that, I don't care what type of frameworks you're using, guys. What is important is that you make assumptions, you think, you share some decisions, you're bold. You might make mistakes, it's fine. But what many candidates, how many candidates structure their replies are, well, you know, we're gonna do a research. Well, qualitative research is gonna answer that. Or we're gonna do an A/B test. Of course you will. In real life conditions, that's what everybody does. But we are in the vacuum of the interview, and what I'm expecting from you is to make assumptions, bold assumptions. Don't like throw all those fancy framework names onto interviewers. They don't care. They heard a gazillion of times what RICE is, like what SMART is, or whatever. Just use your own mind and try to think through. Another one is super important, is, and it's very related to the actual seniority of the candidates, but you have to keep that in mind. If you treat a product as a set of features or a feature and not a business, you will score lower. The reality is, product, like an app or a service, is just a tool that enables the value stream delivery from your organization to the end customer. It's just a tool. And the product exists in a context, right? There are more layers to it. There are macro factors. There is an operational layer. There is a marketplace layer if you're building a marketplace business. So all those dynamics, they kind of interact with each other, and you have to outline those. But if you just narrowly look at the product as a feature that needs to be developed, well, you're going to score lower. Another one is being super dependent on the interviewer. Right? It is important to clarify the goal. It is important to align frameworks. But what you shouldn't do is that you shouldn't always ask your interviewer like what he or she expects. You should lead the interview, because if you don't, the signal that it sends is that you're afraid of making decisions. So you're not ready to take responsibility and drive this forward. Which, in a case, if you start operating in the context of the actual company, would mean that you will be very stakeholder dependent rather than think for yourself. Yes, we've talked about customer empathy a lot, about how we should be focused on customers, and most of the product managers are, at least on words. We are customer obsessed, we're customer centric, but in 90% of the interviews that I do, candidates, they come up with very ambiguous customer framing. For example, I give a case, like, we want to build a T-selling business. T-sales, like, what the hell? Why should Bolt even bother, right? But that's the case, right? And candidates typically tell me, well, we're going to focus on tea drinkers. Awesome. But who the hell are those tea drinkers? Like, there are so many like generational layers to it. There are so many use cases. There are preferences. So if you're building a product for such an ambiguous audience, you're essentially building a product for nobody. So please be very specific when you address this part of the interview. Be very specific in terms of who you target, and please provide the rationale why you're choosing this customer and not the other one. Last but not the least is answering the questions that were never asked in the first place. One great example is, okay, like the macro environment for the same T-sales business is superb. There is compound average annual growth rate. The addressable market size is quite huge. We want to go there. And the first thing that candidates starts doing, candidates starts sizing the market. I never expected the candidate to size the market because this is already baked in the conditions of the actual case. So please do not answer the questions that the interviewer didn't ask, because you are just wasting the precious time that could have been dedicated to scoring this interview. All right, this has been a bunch, but to kind of sum it all up, please be goal-focused. Don't be theoretical. Forget about the frameworks. Nobody cares about them. Treat product as a business, not as a feature or a set of features. Don't be overly dependent on the interviewer. Try to lead the case. Be very specific when it comes to customers and framing who your target audience is. And don't answer the questions that were not asked. All right. With that said, you should probably be already tense. But now the relief is coming. It is a framework. And I kind of abstracted this framework from hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and I looked at only the success cases. And I tried to map out like what specific steps those candidates followed through in order to score the interview. So that's kind of an abstraction of this whole process. It has 3 steps, just so it's easier to memorize. First one, you have to clarify. Second one, you have to identify what is the focus. And the third one, you have to do a breakdown. I'm going to go more granular, and I'm going to explain each step of the way. So first, you kind of clarify. Then you understand what the focus is. You do a breakdown, and you do a wrap-up. The whole process ideally should take maximum 40 minutes, because there is much more to the interview than just the case alone. There is introduction, there are some Q&As, and so on. But I'm going to zoom into each of those steps. So we start with the warm-up, right? Warm-up consists of 3 sub-parts. One, we have to restate the conditions of the case, because the way you understood the case might be different from the way the interviewer actually wanted to give it to you. Secondly, clarify the goal. As we've already mentioned, we have to be goal-focused. And third, take time to prepare the structure. Don't be afraid to take like up to 5 minutes. I do appreciate when candidates tell me, I'm going to take a few minutes to think this through and write this down. So take your time. The second part is the actual case solving. First, you have to identify the case type. You remember those 3 buckets we've been talking about, the strategy, the design, and the execution. So once you have figured out like what is the case type you're solving, you have to understand the focus, right? So if the focus is within the strategy, then you are ready to do a breakdown. For instance, if we're talking about the strategy, how do you break down this case? So first of all, you have to identify where do we play. By that, how big is the market, the addressable market opportunity? What is the chunk of this market that we can actually capture? Like, what's the competition there like? Is it like overly saturated, or it's a blue ocean? Second, identify how do we win? And by that, like, what's the business model, the viable business model that can help us kickstart the business? Are there any operational constraints? Are there any supply constraints? How much is going to cost us? And the second, like, what's the value proposition? And in order to define the value proposition, you'll have to zoom in on who your customer is and what are the pain points and what specific value that you can provide that will kind of move that customer away from the competition to your service. And then do a wrap-up. And here, there are 2 steps. If you have extra time, you can make a disclaimer and provide some moonshot ideas. But be careful, provide a disclaimer, because you might create a wrong impression on the interviewer. And do a wrap-up. Basically, provide a recommendation to the interviewer based on the conditions of the case, what the company should do, like based on all the rationale that you provided. It is super important because that's a logical closure for the whole case. All right, so now that you are armed, let's look in the lab. Let's say you've already passed the interview. What happens afterwards? Every company has a MISI, like mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive breakdown of competencies for a product manager. Some have matrices, some have fancy diagrams like this one. But what is actually important are 4 skills. One is being goal-oriented, as we've already discussed. Two, it's about being structured, both in your writing, in your thinking, and in the way you speak. Three, it's about, well, of course, being customer-obsessed, but being very specific. And four, this is bold-flavored, but I think product manager slowly goes there. It's about being capable of owning a business rather than just being a backlog operator. That's how kind of a competency matrix looks like at Bolt. So on one scale you have the seniority level, on another scale you have a specific competency. And once like the interviewer goes like through a funnel, we kind of are trying to map that candidate onto a specific position that suits the candidate suits the candidate most. But what is important here is that there are two variables that go through this whole matrix. One is the skill spectrum. The more experienced you are, the more senior, the more skills you are expected to have. For instance, if you're a GPM plus candidate, you're expected to own a business strategy, and you're expected to have leadership experience. You're expected to own a chunk of the business and have a contribution into the business strategy. The second one is the time horizon. It's also very dependent on the seniority level of the candidate. So the less senior, the more junior, well, the more junior the candidate is, like the less ownership there is. Probably it's backlog limited, right? And backlog usually has a time horizon of like 4 months, a quarter. If we're talking about SPM level roles, then the SPM is already expected to own a product strategy, which might last a year plus, and GPM would be expected to make a contribution on a business strategy, which has a longer span, like 2 to 4 years, and the goal of this business strategy is to figure out the ROI and the payback of the actual business. So that's what is important. But at the end of this all, don't dwell. Like, interviews are just a numbers game. But there is a trick that you can kind of follow in order to increase your chances of scoring the offer. Align your actual seniority to the expectation bar of the company. So if you have 0 experience in product management, don't target big tech. Because like the lowest expectation bar for a middle product manager in a big tech company would be like 4 or 5 years. So the probability of you scoring this interview would be like close to 0. But if you're focused on an early stage startup companies, the likelihood that you're going to get an offer is much higher. And that's experience, it's something that you should be focused on, right? You should build experience no matter what type of company you work for. And then later on, once you have that experience, you pass the bar, you can reinvest it into working in bigger tech. All right, let's sum it all up. There was probably a lot of information to digest at the same time, but let's do a flash sum up. So the competition there is fierce. I'm not going to restate the numbers, you see them here. The whole interview process is at least 4 and 7+ step funnel, which can last anywhere from 2 to 6 months easily. There are 3 core cases. In most mature product organizations, you have 3 core cases: strategy, design, and execution. There is a 3-step framework that you can follow to crack those cases. Clarify the goal, restate the conditions of the case, understand the type of case and define the focus, and finally do a breakdown of the case. If you want to succeed, you have to focus on those 4 skill sets. Be goal-focused, be systematic, be customer-driven, and show the interviewer that you're capable of owning a business, not just a feature or a backlog. And if we're talking about candidate assessment, seniority of the candidate is defined by time horizon and the ownership scope. All right, so if you enjoyed this, you can find my Substack blog by following this QR code, where I basically publish weekly practical, no BS advice on how to advance in product management. Thank you so much for your undivided attention, and I will be glad to answer any of your questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And actually, we have time just for one or maximum two questions. So be quick. No one?
Perfect. It was super straightforward.
Not just so short. Yeah, yeah. I see.
Okay, I see we already have two candidates for questions at least. What is your favorite case question, interview question?
Yeah, it's strategy. I typically ask questions along the lines of, we want to pursue a certain business opportunity. One case example is T-sales business. Or, like, I don't know, we want to build a ride-hailing service, but for boats in Netherlands. Is it a viable opportunity we should go for? Why I like such cases is because they test much more skills from a candidate, because they're very ambiguous. So I typically go for the strategy, yeah.
Fun, thank you.
Yeah, sure, great question.
Hi, Mikhail. Thank you for the presentation. It was brilliant. My question is not related to the interview, most for the product. Can you give us an example of some product that inspired you recently and solved a customer's pain?
Okay. Well, I'm a tech pessimist, so I generally think most products suck. But yeah, there was one specific product. I think it's Travel Perk. We use it inside the organization to book our corporate travel. I think it's brilliant. It exceeds your expectations every single step of the way and makes this internal corporate hurdle so easy. Just, yeah, I literally had a wow moment when I used it.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation. Most of us know that at the interview, especially at FANG, yeah, there are some questions that looks irrelevant, maybe stupid, and in some point they looks totally out of scope for the interview. They are made to make the person uncomfortable and to see how the person will react and how they will analyze the question. Do you have this type of a question, what you always asking, and what's the best answer you received?
Okay, it's a good question. Generally, I think that like 90%, 99% of the questions during the interview make candidates uncomfortable. So if you go beyond those three typical buckets like strategy, like design and execution, and ask some brain teasers, right, which we usually don't, because it's considered not a very good practice, then yes, the candidates might be dumbstruck. I've seen a few cases where the candidates were dumbstruck with the strategy case, and I couldn't understand what I'm expecting from them. And if such cases happen, I usually try to kind of lead the candidate and give some hints so that the candidate could kind of find the ground and figure out how to move forward. Does that address your question?
Actually, no.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's maybe rephrase this.
I am more related, yeah, regarding the bad practice you mentioned, the brain.
No, the brain teasers.
Yes.
Typically, companies don't ask them. I mean, there are instances in Google where this has been done, but they don't really test the skills that are relevant at the company, like in which, like at Bolt, for instance. We don't expect product managers to solve brain teasers creatively. What they expect them is to take ownership of the business. And so the questions are structured accordingly. And usually I think one commonality between those brain teasers and those questions is the ambiguity, right? The candidate has to figure out how to approach this problem and how to break it down. I think that's the commonality. So strategy case, I think, kind of does pretty much the same effect on most candidates to the extent.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks.